We've already talked about some of the ways industrialization transformed the urban environment in the late 19th century. Let's say a few things about some of the social and cultural transformations that take place at more or less the same time. Changes in the American class structure as a result of these economic changes. First of all, industrialization in the late 19th century produced a small number of wealthy individuals who were wealthier, and wealthier in a different way than had previously been possible in the American economy. They were sometimes satirized as robber barons. These are the people that built the companies that transformed the economy. People like Andrew Carnegie in steel, J.P. Morgan in banking, the Vanderbilts in transportation. And this was in many ways the first generation of American rich people who were famous for being as rich as they were. And you might read about them in the transformed newspaper in the late 19th century, for example. And there was a great deal of political discussion in the late 19th century about accumulation of wealth at the very top. Another group of economic winners, however, were what you might refer to as a new urban middle class, many of whom had jobs in those new bureaucracies that we discussed when we talked about the organizational transformation of American business. And in the late 19th century, when you use the term middle class, you increasingly mean what we usually mean when we use that term today. You tend to be talking about someone who is urban or suburban. You tend to be talking about someone who makes a living by sitting at a desk and dealing with information or working in a bureaucracy, or maybe someone who works in one of the skilled professions. Earlier in the 19th century, if you talked about an American middle class, you might be thinking of a small landowner or farmer. By the 1880s or 1890s, the American city was full of this new middle class who represented in some ways the ideal consumer for many of the products that we've been discussing. Industrialization also creates a new kind of industrial working class of people who worked in these large factories. And a great deal of political and social contention in the late 19th century was generated by these class changes. In particular, there was a generation of occasional labor violence in industries like the railroad industry, iron and steel, coal mining. These are images, for example, from a magazine called Harper's Weekly in 1877. Showing some of the violence of the summer railroad strike in 1877, where several dozen people around the country, all throughout the railroad network in the Northeast and Midwest, were killed in days of rioting. The worst being in Pittsburgh, where portions of the railroad infrastructure were set on fire in clashes between workers and the militias called out to try to put down the strike. And one of the basic political and social issues of contention in the late 19th century surrounded who should benefit from the wealth that the economy had created. Who created that wealth? Did workers create it, or did owners and managers create it? Obviously, the most contentious of these battles were in industries like railroad and iron and steel and other manufacturing industries. But we will see the impact of this in sports. In baseball in the 1880s, a union formed because baseball players were concerned that the business of baseball was not adequately recognizing the degree to which they generated the value in professional baseball. And in 1890, there was an upstart league that competed with the existing National League and American Association, formed by striking players. And so issues of labor and management weren't just contentious in heavy manufacturing industries. They were contentious throughout the American economy in a variety of ways. And we'll see some examples of that when we talk about the business of baseball in the 1880s and 1890s in a later module.